They arrived with clipboards, fake patches, and threats, convinced they could scare a man into surrendering his home. What they did not know was that 6 Navy SEALs were already on their way to his front door. The sound came sharp and sudden. 3 hard knocks against the front door of Calvin Mercer's house in Concord, North Carolina. It was neither late nor early, just that stretch of evening when most people were beginning to unwind, dinners simmering on stoves, televisions flickering in living rooms. Calvin stood in the kitchen rinsing a plate when he heard it. Something about the knock did not feel casual. It was not the soft rap of a neighbor stopping by to say hello. It was forceful, demanding. He dried his hands on a dish towel and walked toward the door, the weight of that knock still pressing against his chest. Calvin was not the sort of man who startled easily. Over the years, he had weathered financial struggles, raised children, and even lost his wife to divorce. But the moment he opened the door, his evening turned into something he never could have imagined. 2 men stood there, both wearing tactical vests with large white letters that read Compliance Division, HOA. They looked like officers, radios clipped to their belts, clipboards in their hands, and serious faces that offered no smile. The taller one, bald with a scar above his right eyebrow, spoke first. "Mr. Mercer?" Calvin blinked. "Yes, that's me." "You have been found in violation of the neighborhood code," the man said in a rehearsed tone. "According to HOA policy, you are required to vacate the property within 48 hours. Calvin let out a short laugh, the kind that escapes when someone tells a bad joke. "What are you talking about? I own this house. I paid off the mortgage years ago. I spoke with the HOA president at the last meeting." The second man, shorter and stockier, with mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes even in the shade, stepped forward. "Doesn't matter. You're in default. We've been authorized to deliver the notice. You've got 2 days to leave." For a moment, Calvin thought it had to be a joke. He looked again at the patch. Compliance Division, HOA. He had lived there nearly a decade. He had seen HOA notices for late payments, trash cans left on the curb, grass that had grown too tall, but never armed men telling someone to get out. "This doesn't make sense," Calvin said, his voice steady. "If I had a problem with the HOA, they would have sent a letter or, at worst, fined me. Nobody shows up in tactical gear." The taller man leaned in just enough to make the air feel heavier. "Sir, we're not here to debate. We're here to enforce. You can leave quietly, or we can escalate the situation." Calvin's jaw tightened. He was not a fighter by nature, but he was not naive either. His father had always told him that real authority never needed to overcompensate. Something about these 2 men was wrong. Their badges looked like cheap laminations from a copy shop. Their clipboards held generic papers, no HOA letterhead, no signatures. And those radios, he realized, were not even turned on. "Let me ask you something," Calvin said, folding his arms. "Who sent you? What's the president's name? What code violation am I supposed to be breaking?" The stockier man shifted, clearly irritated. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're giving you a chance to leave on your own. Most people take it." Calvin stared at them in silence, the tension stretching between them. He could feel the unease sliding under his skin. These men were not from the HOA, not from any official agency. They were impostors. But the problem was they were standing on his porch, trying to force him out of his own house. "You 2 need to get off my property," Calvin said at last, his voice firm but cutting. The taller man smirked. "Or what? You're going to call the police and tell them the HOA came to your door? Go ahead. Let's see how fast they show up for that." Calvin's chest tightened, not with fear, but with anger. He knew this was bigger than a misunderstanding. It was a trap, a scam designed to scare him into giving up something he had worked too hard to keep. He looked past them toward the street, hoping a neighbor might be outside. No one. Only the distant sound of a lawnmower and a dog barking somewhere down the block. The stockier man lowered his voice almost to a growl. "Last warning. 48 hours. After that, we handle it our way." Calvin stayed still, watching them until they finally turned and walked toward a black SUV parked at the curb. He closed the door and locked it. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from fury. He still did not know that reinforcements were already on the way. Old friends who were about to turn that night upside down in ways the fake officers never imagined. But the problem had not finished knocking. This was only the beginning. Calvin did not sit down after he locked the door. He paced the living room, his mind spinning. Who in the world had the nerve to show up dressed like the law, with fake compliance patches, threatening to throw him out of his own house? He pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts, stopping on the number of the HOA president. Then he paused. Something told him not to call yet. Whoever those men were, they wanted to see him rattled. They wanted him to panic and make desperate calls. He was not going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he took a deep breath, opened the curtains, and looked out at the street. The black SUV was still there. The two men had not left. They sat inside, the driver in the front seat, the passenger tapping something on a tablet, watching him, waiting. Calvin muttered under his breath, "Yeah, real official." He opened the door again and stepped out onto the porch, refusing to let them think he was hiding. "Hey," he called, his voice loud enough for half the block to hear. "You mind telling me who exactly sent you here?" The SUV door opened and the taller man stepped out, his heavy boots hitting the pavement. He walked toward Calvin with a slow, deliberate stride. "Already told you," he said, his tone sharp. "We're here on behalf of the HOA." Calvin shook his head. "No, you didn't tell me anything. You threw a line at me and hoped I'd swallow it. So let's try again. Name. Which board member authorized this?" The man stopped at the edge of the grass, his jaw tightening. "You're asking too many questions for a guy who's about to lose his house." That did it. Calvin stepped down from the porch, closing the distance until they stood only a few feet apart. "You picked the wrong door," he said in a low voice. "I've been paying into this neighborhood since before you probably knew it existed. If the board had a problem, I'd get an email, a letter, or a meeting, not two guys in fake vests trying to force me out." The passenger climbed out of the SUV now, walking over with his mirrored sunglasses glinting. He pulled a sheet from his clipboard and shoved it toward Calvin. "Here, read it. You'll see we're not playing." Calvin grabbed the paper and glanced at it. It was ridiculous. No letterhead, no signatures, no official seal, just a typed form with blank lines and a few bold phrases. Code violation 14B. Default. Mandatory eviction. It looked like something pulled from a free online template. He looked up and smiled. "Seriously, you think anyone's gonna fall for this garbage?" He waved the paper in the air. "This isn't even worth the ink." The shorter man tensed. "You don't get it, do you? We don't need you to believe us. We just need you to pack your things and leave. Most people don't argue. They're too scared. They don't want trouble." "But you came because I didn't scare easy," Calvin answered sharply. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and taut. The taller man leaned forward just enough to lower his voice. "Listen, friend, we can do this the polite way, or we can do it the hard way. Nobody wants the hard way." Calvin stared at him, refusing to yield. He could feel his heart beating faster now, not from fear, but from adrenaline. These men were not just scammers. They were predators betting on intimidation to make someone fold. But Calvin had grown up tough. He had been through the kind of real fights in life that leave scars. He was not going to bend for a fake eviction notice. "If you put one more foot on this porch," Calvin said, his voice as firm as stone, "I promise you'll regret it." The shorter man grimaced. "What are you going to do? Call the police? They'll take hours to get here, and by then we'll be gone." Calvin's lips curved into the slightest of smiles. "I won't need the police." The taller man lifted his head, curious. "Oh yeah? Who you got?" Then Calvin's eyes shifted toward the end of the street, where a line of headlights had just turned the corner. 3 vehicles moved slowly down the block. At first the impostors did not notice, but Calvin did. He knew those cars. He knew who those men were. His backup was not a what. It was a who. The taller man glanced over his shoulder and frowned. "Friends of yours?" Calvin crossed his arms. "You could say that." The vehicles stopped. Engines cut off. Doors opened one after another, and 6 men stepped out, each carrying a presence that could not be mistaken for anything else. Broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a way of standing that said they had seen things most people never would. Jonas Reddick, Marcus Vale, Pierce Lockhart, Damian Crowell, Silas Trent, Boone Kessler, all of them former Navy SEALs, all of them Calvin's brothers in arms. The taller impostor's smile finally faltered. But this was not the end of the confrontation. It was only about to get louder. The moment Calvin's friends stepped out of their vehicles, the air changed. You could feel it in the way the impostors tensed, in how their earlier arrogance suddenly seemed to crumble. These were not just a couple of guys stopping by for beers. This was a wall of muscle, discipline, and calm authority walking up the driveway. Jonas Reddick, tall, with streaks of gray in his beard and a gaze that could freeze a room, spoke first. "Cal, what's going on here?" His tone was steady, but there was steel underneath. Calvin gestured toward the two so-called compliance officers. "These clowns say they're from the HOA. Told me I have to pack up and leave my own house in 2 days." The men exchanged quick looks. Pierce Lockhart let out a sharp laugh that cut through the tension. "You're kidding, right?" Marcus Vale, the shorter of the group, stepped forward, his eyes locked on the imposters. "HOA Compliance Division. Wow, curious. Never heard of that in my life. Mind showing us some real credentials?" The taller imposter tensed but tried to keep his composure. "This is official business. Doesn't concern you. Step aside." Jonas did not move. None of them did. "You just made it our business." Silas Trent tilted his head, studying the patches on their vests. "Looks like you ordered those from a surplus site last week. Embroidery's too clean. No wear. Real field gear doesn't look like that." The shorter imposter adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, his voice sharp. "We're not here to debate uniforms. We're here to enforce the rules." Damian Crowell crossed his arms. "What rules? Name the statute. Give us the HOA code you're enforcing. Shouldn't be hard if you're legitimate." The imposters hesitated. That pause, just a second too long, was all the confirmation the SEALs needed. Boone Kessler let out a low laugh and shook his head. "These guys are bluffing so hard it hurts." Calvin, now standing a few feet behind his friends, felt a surge of relief. He had not been imagining it. Those men were not real, and now he had backup who knew how to spot a lie better than anyone. The taller imposter tried again, doubling down. "You don't understand how serious this is. He's in violation. He has to leave. We have papers." Jonas interrupted him, snatching the flimsy notice from Calvin's hands and holding it up for everyone to see. "My kid could write this in 10 minutes. No signatures, no legal reference, nothing binding. You think anyone's going to believe this?" The imposter's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, but Jonas did not move an inch. Calvin noticed neighbors beginning to peer through curtains, some even stepping out onto their porches. Word was spreading. People could feel the tension in the air, and curiosity was drawing them in. Pierce, who never minced words, leaned forward. "Let me ask you something straight. What's the con here? You guys running a scam, picking houses at random, and hoping to scare people into leaving so you can clean them out?" The shorter man answered quickly. "Watch your mouth." Pierce's tone stayed sharp. "Or what? You going to arrest me with those toy radios? Maybe pull those badges from the dollar store again?" Silas smiled, though his voice remained even. "You made a big mistake coming here." Calvin stepped forward again, more confident now. "You really thought I was going to believe the HOA sent you in combat vests with no real IDs? That I was just going to pack up and leave? Man, I've worked too hard for this house. I raised kids here. You don't get to walk in and threaten me." The taller imposter's confidence cracked a little. His shoulders shifted, his posture loosened as if he realized the numbers were no longer in his favor. Still, he tried to regain control. "Everyone thinks this is a joke, but you're interfering with official duties. That's a crime." Boone let out a bark of laughter. "The only crime happening here is you pretending to be something you're not. And trust me, impersonating a law enforcement officer carries a real sentence." The imposters exchanged nervous glances. They were not used to being questioned so directly. Calvin realized then how rehearsed they had been before, throwing out vague lines, relying on intimidation, hoping no one would push back. Now their script was falling apart, and they had no backup plan. Jonas folded the fake notice in half and stuffed it into the imposter's vest pocket. "Here's the deal. You've got 2 options. Get back in your vehicle and get off this street right now, or stay, and we let the police sort it out. Either way, this is not going to end the way you planned." The shorter imposter clenched his jaw, muttering something under his breath. The taller one scanned the group, calculating. Calvin could see it in his eyes. He was weighing whether these men were bluffing or whether they would actually call the police. What the imposters did not know was that Jonas already had his phone out, thumb hovering over the dial screen, ready to press call. But just as the tension peaked, Something else raised the stakes even higher. The street had grown unusually quiet. Neighbors stayed frozen on their porches and at their windows, tense, trying to catch every word but too cautious to step in. Calvin remained firmly behind his friends, heart beating in time with the confrontation. The impostors shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance giving way to defensiveness. They had not expected so many eyes on them. Then, without warning, the low rumble of another engine cut through the silence. A dark pickup truck turned onto the block, headlights cutting through the evening haze. It stopped behind the line of parked vehicles, a few yards from the black SUV the impostors had arrived in. Pierce Lockhart, who had kept his arms crossed with an easy air, gave a half smile. Looks like the cavalry just arrived. From the driver's seat stepped Dean Morrick, another former SEAL who had not been able to make it earlier. He was broader than the rest, with shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway and a calm that unsettled people before he even spoke. He closed the door and walked up the driveway, scanning the scene the way only men trained for conflict can. Every detail, every angle, every possible threat. "Quite the party you've got here, Cal," he said, his tone dry but sharp. Calvin exhaled, the tension sliding from his shoulders just a little. "Glad you made it, brother. You walked right into a mess." Dean looked at the impostors, eyes narrowing at their vests. "And who are these?" "They say they're HOA cops," Jonas answered, his voice flat with disbelief. Dean raised an eyebrow, his expression almost amused. "HOA cops? That's a new one." The impostors did not like the laughter filtering through the group. The taller one stepped forward, trying once more to seize control. "This is not a joke. He's in default. This is an official notice." Dean stopped cold, looking the man up and down. "Official? That vest you're wearing is poorly stitched. The radio's not even on, and that patch looks like you bought it on eBay. You're faking it." The imposter tensed, but Dean's calm certainty made him hesitate. Marcus Vale stepped forward now, his voice low but clear enough for the neighbors to hear. "You know what the problem is with pretending to be something you're not? Eventually someone shows up who knows the real thing, and when that happens, every mistake gets exposed." The shorter imposter spat back. "We don't answer to you. We're here on business. Step aside." Silas Trent tilted his head, his tone measured but cutting. "Business? What business? Running an extortion operation in broad daylight? You picked the wrong address for that. We're not dealing with a scared retiree or a single mother you can intimidate. This man has friends who won't let you harass him." Calvin finally stepped up beside Silas, his anger settling into conviction. "I'm not leaving, and these men aren't either. So why don't you tell me the real reason you're here?" The impostors exchanged a look. Their silence spoke louder than words. The taller one clenched his jaw, but the rehearsed lines were gone. He had nothing left but presence, and even that no longer felt imposing. Dean's voice cut through the air again, calm as ever. "I've seen this game before. Intimidation, false authority. You scare a few people enough that they leave, and you walk away with valuables. Maybe even try to flip the property if you're bold. But here's the problem. You ran into a man who doesn't scare easy. And the worst part, you showed up the same day 6 SEALs and I had planned to get together." The neighbors reacted to that. Murmurs spread along the street. A couple of phones lifted higher, recording everything. The impostors had thought they were the hunters. Now they were the ones cornered, by an audience and by men who saw straight through them. The taller imposter finally snapped, voice rising. "You're interfering with a federal matter. That's obstruction." Jonas let out a laugh so sharp it made the man flinch. "Federal? Now you're reaching. The HOA isn't federal, and neither are you. You've been caught, and the only reason you're still standing here is because we're giving you the option to leave." The shorter imposter's hand moved near his vest as if he wanted to reach for something. Immediately, Boone Kessler's voice rang out. "Don't move that hand." His tone was enough to freeze the air. The imposter slowly lowered his arm, realizing how badly outmatched he was. Calvin looked around. The street had become a stage. Neighbors with phones raised, children peeking through curtains. The imposters were visibly rattled, and in the middle of it all, his old friends formed a barrier between him and the frauds. The taller imposter muttered something low to his partner, but Jonas heard it. "We'll come back another time." Dean moved closer, his voice low and certain. "You're not coming back here, because next time it won't just be neighbors with cameras. It'll be the police, and we'll make sure every second of this recording gets handed over." The impostors hesitated, clearly weighing their options. Their SUV sat only a few feet away, but leaving now meant admitting failure in front of everyone. Staying meant being exposed even further. The SEALs were not ready to let it go, and the impostors were not ready to surrender. Not yet. The neighborhood held its breath. You could feel the tension running the length of the street as Calvin's old friends spread out, forming an invisible line between the impostors and the house. The impostors had arrived with confidence when they first knocked on the door, but now their certainty looked thinner with every passing second. Jonas Reddick broke the silence first, his voice low but carrying across the entire lawn. "Let's keep it simple. If you're official, you'll have IDs. Show them." The taller impostor's lips curved into a weak smile. "We don't have to prove anything to you." "Then you've already shown us everything we need to know," Jonas answered. Pierce Lockhart, who always carried a sharp edge of humor, stepped up beside Jonas. "You know what's crazy? You came onto this street thinking you could scare a homeowner into packing up. You thought the vest, the boots, the act would be enough, but you didn't check who lives here. You didn't know who his friends were. That's a mistake." The shorter imposter tried to puff himself up. "We're authorized. We don't need your permission." Damian Crowell's voice cut the air like a knife. "Authorized by who? Give us a name. Give us a contact. The HOA president. A city official. Anyone." Silence. Only the soft scrape of a shoe on pavement as the imposter shifted his weight. Boone Kessler let out a laugh, one of those deep ones that made it clear he was not amused at all. "That's what I thought. Nothing. You came here with a script, and now the script is falling apart." The imposter's eyes drifted toward the gathering crowd. More neighbors had come outside now, lining the sidewalk with phones raised. What had started as a private game of intimidation was turning into a public humiliation. Silas Trent tilted his head, eyes narrowed as he scanned the impostors from head to toe. "Tell me something. What was the end game here? Scare him into leaving, and then what? Walk in and strip the house of everything you could carry? Maybe stay and hope nobody asks questions? You didn't think it through." Calvin, emboldened by his friends, stepped up beside Silas. "That's what makes me sick. They thought they could knock on the wrong door, tell a lie, and I'd just fall apart. They looked at me and figured I'd scare easy. They don't know me at all." The taller imposter's face hardened. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jonas stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood only inches away. His voice was calm, firm, but dangerous. "No, you don't know who you're dealing with. Every man here has faced things worse than anything you can imagine. You don't scare us. You don't even register to us." The imposter opened his mouth as if to answer, but Jonas raised a hand. "Save it. We don't want excuses. We want you off this property." The shorter imposter tried to regain control, lifting his clipboard like a weapon. "We have authority. We have papers." Pierce stepped forward and yanked the clipboard from his hands in one smooth motion, then flipped through it. His laugh was sharp. "Authority. This is a printout from some internet eviction template. You didn't even bother changing the default font. My niece could do better for a school project." He tore the paper cleanly in half and tossed the pieces onto the grass. That drew a murmur from the crowd. A couple of neighbors chuckled under their breath. The imposter's power was fading with every second. Damian crossed his arms. "You've got one move left. Leave." The taller imposter's eyes narrowed as he looked between the group of veterans and the SUV. His pride was wounded, but his options were shrinking. Calvin did not give an inch. "This is over for you. Whatever you thought you were going to do, it's done. You're not coming back. Not to me, and not to anyone else on this street." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Jonas turned to Calvin, his voice lower but firm. "Cal, say it." Calvin looked at the impostors, then at the neighbors, then back at them. His voice carried clear across the lawn. "You heard the man. Get off my property." The impostors hesitated, clearly weighing pride against the reality of the situation. The crowd, the cameras, the veterans, they were cornered. But just as they started to move toward their SUV, something in their posture shifted, signaling they would not leave easily. The taller imposter's body language gave him away. His jaw worked back and forth, fists clenched, and although he leaned toward the vehicle, he was not moving with the intention of retreating. Calvin caught it instantly. He knew when a man was backing down and when he was looking for a way to strike. "Watch it," Jonas murmured, eyes locked on the imposter. The shorter one tugged at his vest as if trying to gather courage, then barked, "You think you can humiliate us? You think you can just—" He cut himself off when a chorus of phones rose higher from the crowd. Now every word was being recorded, every movement captured. Pierce smiled, sharp as a blade. "Go ahead. Finish that sentence. Make it real clear for the internet." The taller imposter turned his head toward him. "Shut your mouth." Pierce did not move. "Or what? You going to write me a ticket in Comic Sans with one of those fake forms?" The crowd chuckled. A wave of laughter rolled along the sidewalk. The imposters were not just losing control. They were becoming the block's joke. Damian Crowell stepped forward, his tone calmer but carrying an edge that demanded attention. "You had the chance to leave clean. You didn't take it. Don't make this worse for yourselves." The taller imposter squared his shoulders, trying to reclaim a shred of authority. "You don't understand who we answer to." Jonas did not let him finish. "What you don't understand is who you're standing in front of. Every man here has been places you wouldn't survive 5 minutes. We've seen real authority. We know how it looks, how it acts, how it carries itself, and you don't have it." The imposter's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The shorter one stepped closer, lifting his chin toward Calvin. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Before Calvin could answer, Boone Kessler's voice rumbled across the yard. "You're wrong. The only thing you'll regret is picking the one street with 7 seals standing on it." The timing could not have been worse for the imposters. At that exact moment, another neighbor walked down the block with his dog, stopped at the scene, and pulled out his phone to record. The crowd had doubled since the first confrontation. People whispered, murmured, pointed. Children were pulled back by their parents, yet even they peeked between legs to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The imposters realized they were no longer facing just a handful of men, but an entire community. Calvin's voice cut through the growing murmur. "You want to keep pushing. Go ahead. Every second you stay, more people are watching. More phones are recording. This ends with the police or it ends with you leaving. Your choice." The shorter imposter forced a frustrated laugh, trying to hide the nerves. "The police won't do anything. You'll see." Dean Morick, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, his tone soft, almost too calm. "That's where you're wrong. Impersonating authority is a charge that sticks, and you just admitted it in front of half a dozen phones. You'd better start thinking whether your pride is worth time in a cell." That shook them. Calvin could see it, the quick change in their breathing, the restless glances toward the SUV, the tightening of shoulders. These were not men ready for jail. They were men who had built their scam in silence and shadows. Now everything was out in the open. Still, the taller imposter made one last desperate move. He pointed a finger at Calvin. "This isn't over. We'll be back." Silas Trent's voice dropped, but it carried clear and sharp as a razor. "No, you won't. Because if you do, it won't just be us here. The police will have your names, your faces, your badges. You won't get a second chance." The imposter paused. His partner muttered something low, "Let's go," and tugged at his arm. But the taller one stayed rooted, unwilling to lose face in front of the audience. That was when Jonas stepped even closer, his shadow falling over the man. "You think standing your ground makes you look strong. It doesn't. It makes you look desperate, and desperate men always make mistakes." The tension stayed thick as concrete. Everyone waited to see what the imposters would do. Finally, the taller one spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and walked toward the SUV. His partner followed more slowly, head down as they climbed into the vehicle. A scattering of applause broke out among the neighbors, not loud, not raucous, but enough to signal that everyone watching knew who had won that fight. Calvin exhaled, but his friends still did not relax. Jonas leaned close to him, voice low. "Don't drop your guard. Men like that don't like to lose. They'll try to come back somehow." Calvin nodded, eyes fixed on the SUV as the imposter started the engine. He could feel it in his gut. This was not finished. But before the imposters could pull away completely, another twist was about to hit the street, and this time it involved the real police. The imposter's SUV roared to life, but it did not move. The taller man sat behind the wheel, knuckles white against the steering wheel, jaw still clenched with stubborn pride. The shorter one tapped nervously on the dashboard, clearly wanting out of there. The crowd's phones kept pointing straight at them, capturing every movement, every flicker of hesitation. Calvin stood at the edge of his lawn, arms crossed. His friends spread around him, forming a human wall between the SUV and the house. Jonas Reddick's eyes narrowed. He raised his voice again. "If you think you can leave and come back later, you're wrong. Because every one of us has your faces on camera now. If you try again, you won't just be a neighborhood problem. You'll be a criminal case." The taller imposter rolled the window down halfway. His voice was low but forced. "You don't understand. We have authorization. You'll be the ones answering questions, not us." Pierce Lockhart snorted. "Authorization? Show it right now. Not some garbage template. Show us a real badge, a real ID. If not, stop pretending." Silas Trent stepped forward, pulled out his own phone, and began recording deliberately in front of the imposter. "Go ahead," he said, his tone mocking. "Tell us your supervisor's name. Let's get it on record. Who do you work for? What agency? What number can we call to verify?" The shorter imposter shot him a glare but did not answer. The crowd murmured again, louder this time. People were putting the pieces together. These were not officers, not HOA representatives. They were frauds wearing a costume of authority. Calvin piled on. "You know the real HOA president's name, Patricia Langford. I've got her number in my phone right now. Want me to call her on speaker so she can confirm she's never heard of you?" The taller imposter's face flushed, and for the first time he broke eye contact. That small crack was enough to set the crowd murmuring again. Several neighbors shook their heads, some muttering under their breath. Boone Kessler's voice cut through the air, low but sharp. They thought they could scare this man out of his house. They thought a fake vest and a few rehearsed lines would be enough, but they didn't count on people standing together. That's where they failed. The shorter imposter's patience snapped. He flung open the SUV door and jumped out, jabbing a finger at Boone. "You don't know what you're messing with. We're not afraid of you." Before he could finish, Jonas stepped between them, towering over the man. Jonas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Put that finger down, right now." The imposter froze, finger still in the air, then slowly lowered it. Jonas leaned in a little closer. "If you're going to threaten someone, threaten me. But understand this. Your scam is over. Everyone here knows what you are. And when the real police get here, they'll know it too." The shorter imposter looked around, and reality finally seemed to sink in. Every phone pointed at him, every face watching, every whisper confirming the fraud. He looked smaller now, stripped of the illusion of control. Calvin seized the moment and raised his voice so the whole block could hear. "These men showed up on my porch claiming to be from the HOA Compliance Division. They told me I had 48 hours to leave my house. They threatened me, but they're not from the HOA. They're scammers." The crowd reacted with a collective murmur. Some even called out. Phones moved closer, recording every word. The imposter's scam was not just breaking, it was collapsing in real time. Pierce clapped once, hard. "And that, folks, is the end of the show. You've been exposed. You've got one move left now. Get in that SUV and disappear before the real police arrive." The taller imposter finally spoke again, though his voice had lost the force it once carried. "You'll regret putting this on camera." Silas smiled with open disdain. "No, you'll regret showing your face on this street." The shorter imposter tried to salvage some dignity. "This isn't the last time you'll see us." Dean Morrick stepped closer, his shadow stretching over the hood of the SUV. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "It is, because the next time you try this, you won't just find veterans in a driveway. You'll find patrol cars waiting. It's over." Finally, the imposters retreated, slamming the doors. The SUV lurched forward and pulled away from the curb. Neighbors erupted into conversation, voices rising, phones still recording as the vehicle disappeared down the street. Calvin exhaled heavily, letting his shoulders drop. "That's it," he murmured. Jonas shook his head. "Not yet. They'll be back, or someone like them will, which means it's time to bring in the police." Calvin nodded, pulling out his phone with a steady hand. "You're right. We're not letting this slide." But while Calvin dialed, the distant sound of sirens made it clear the night was about to take an even bigger turn. The far-off wail of sirens grew closer, echoing between the houses until the flashing blue lights swept onto the block. The imposter's SUV had not gone far. It was caught at the stop sign at the end of the street when two patrol cars boxed it in. Tires screeched, doors flew open, and real officers stepped out with hands near their holsters, voices booming with orders that cut through the night. "Shut off the vehicle, hands where we can see them." The neighborhood became a theater. Children who had been watching from behind curtains pressed their faces harder against the glass. Neighbors who had only peeked now came fully out onto their porches with phones raised. Calvin and his friends moved closer to the sidewalk, watching as the imposter's confidence crumbled under real authority. The taller imposter raised his hands reluctantly, jaw clenched, while the shorter one kept muttering under his breath until an officer shouted, "Now!" Both climbed out of the SUV, hands up, their false bravado collapsing in real time. Jonas leaned toward Calvin. "Now we'll see how official they really are." One of the officers, Sergeant Willis, broad-shouldered and carrying the tone of a man who had been doing this too long to play games, approached the SUV cautiously. The beam of his flashlight swept the dashboard, the back seat, the gear tossed carelessly inside. He turned and called to his partner. "Yeah, looks like a costume, not even police-grade equipment." The second officer, younger but sharp-eyed, yanked the fake vest off the shorter imposter and held it up. "Guys, they bought this online. Doesn't even have the right stitching for tactical gear." The imposter tried to speak. "We're from the HOA Compliance Division. This is a misunderstanding." Sergeant Willis raised an eyebrow. "HOA Compliance Division? That doesn't exist, son. And even if it did, you wouldn't be showing up in tactical gear making threats." He glanced toward the growing crowd of neighbors, many of whom nodded and called out in agreement. Calvin spoke, his voice carrying. "They told me I had 48 hours to leave my house. They gave me fake papers. They threatened to handle it their way if I didn't comply." That drew a fresh murmur of indignation from the neighbors. More phones recorded every second. The younger officer turned to the imposters. "You realize impersonating authority is a serious offense, right? Wearing gear like this to intimidate people can get you real time." The taller imposter clenched his jaw. "We weren't impersonating police. We were representing the HOA. We were sent." "Then let's call them right now," Pierce Lockhart called from behind Calvin. "Call Patricia Langford. See if she's ever heard of you." The officer nodded, pulling out his notepad. "Good idea. We'll verify." He wrote the name down. "But until then, you two are being detained for questioning." The shorter imposter's face went red. "You can't do this. We were only trying." Sergeant Willis stepped closer, voice hard as steel. "Only trying to scare a man out of his house in front of his neighbors. Don't play dumb. You're lucky this didn't escalate worse because half this block has your performance on camera." The imposter closed his mouth and stared at the ground. Dean Morick crossed his arms, speaking loud enough for the crowd to hear. "These guys picked the wrong neighborhood. They thought they could run a scam and walk away without anyone questioning them. They didn't count on people standing together." The crowd murmured in agreement, some even clapping softly. The tension that had hung heavy over the street was transforming into relief, though the anger at what had almost happened still lingered. The younger officer moved in to handcuff the imposters, reciting their rights in a precise, practiced tone. The taller one tensed but did not resist. The shorter one twisted, throwing one last desperate look at Calvin. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Calvin met his eyes without blinking. "The only thing I'll regret is if you ever show your face here again." As the officers guided the men toward the patrol cars, Jonas leaned toward Calvin. "This is what justice looks like in broad daylight. No shadows to hide in." Calvin exhaled slowly, watching as the imposters were finally placed in the back of a patrol car. The neighborhood buzzed with relief, the energy shifting now that the threat was contained. Yet he could not shake the thought of what might have happened if his friends had not arrived when they did. Sergeant Willis walked back over, nodding toward Calvin. "We'll need you to make a statement. Same for your neighbors. But I'll tell you this. It's a good thing you stood your ground. These guys have probably run this scam before. Tonight, it ends." Calvin nodded, grateful. "Thank you, officer." The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations humming, neighbors thanking Calvin and his friends, some shaking hands, others offering to share their recordings with the police. Children whispered among themselves, eyes wide, replaying what they had just witnessed as if it were a movie. But as the flashing lights painted the street, Calvin's chest remained tight. He knew this was no longer just about him. It was about every homeowner, every person who might have been fooled if these men had knocked on a different door the next day. The weight of what had happened would spread through the whole community. The next day, news of what had taken place on Calvin Mercer's street had traveled beyond the block. It was no longer just neighbors whispering across lawns. Local Facebook groups filled with posts. Phone camera clips had been uploaded. Even the Concord Gazette ran a short online piece. Men impersonating HOA agents arrested after confrontation on residential street. Calvin sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the air cooler than usual, watching as cars one after another slowed when they passed his house. Some drivers rolled down their windows for a look. Others nodded in solidarity before driving on. Calvin was not used to being the center of attention, but the previous night had turned him into a reluctant local figure. Jonas joined him, leaning against the railing with arms crossed. "You realize you're probably a neighborhood hero now, right?" Calvin shook his head. "I'm not a hero, I just didn't want to be intimidated out of my own house." He took a sip of coffee, looking down the street. "Truth is, I keep thinking what would have happened if I'd been alone, if you hadn't shown up, if the neighbors hadn't recorded." Jonas's voice softened. "That's why last night matters. It shows how easy it is to be fooled when you're isolated. But together, that's a different story." A group of neighbors approached the porch. Mrs. Hadley, who lived 2 doors down, spoke first. "Calvin, we all wanted to thank you. What you and your friends did kept this neighborhood safe. I have grandchildren in my house. If they had knocked on my door instead of yours—" Her voice trailed off, her hand trembling slightly. Calvin stood, setting the cup aside. "You don't have to thank me. Honestly, I was scared too. But sometimes you don't choose the fight. It just shows up at your door." Another neighbor, Luis Ortega, held up his phone. "I sent the video to the police this morning. They said it'll help build the case against those guys. If you hadn't stood firm, Cal, they could still be out there doing the same thing to someone else." The group murmured in agreement, some nodding, others clapping Calvin on the back. Pierce Lockhart walked up from the driveway, catching the end of the conversation. He grinned sideways. "Don't let him fool you, folks. Cal's tougher than he looks." Calvin shot him a look. "Don't start." The neighbors laughed, but the laughter carried an undercurrent of relief. They were glad the danger had passed, glad the impostors had been caught. Yet the reminder of how close it had been still lingered. Later that afternoon, a community meeting was called at the small recreation center just a mile away. The place filled quickly. Residents from several blocks, members of the HOA board, even local reporters. Calvin sat near the front with his friends flanking him like a protective circle, though his presence alone seemed to reassure everyone in the room. Patricia Langford, the HOA president, stood at the podium. She looked tired but resolute. "Last night, 2 individuals impersonated HOA representatives and attempted to illegally force one of our homeowners from his property. Let me be clear, the HOA does not, and never will, enforce anything through intimidation or unannounced visits. This was a scam, and thanks to Calvin and his neighbors, it has been exposed." Applause filled the room, though Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He did not like being the center of attention, but he understood the importance. Patricia continued, "We are working with local authorities to make sure this never happens again. But this is a reminder, if something does not feel right, speak up, ask questions, protect one another." After the meeting, people crowded around Calvin and his friends. Some wanted to shake their hands. Others shared their own fears, stories of fraudulent phone calls, suspicious letters, strangers knocking at odd hours. What had happened at Calvin's house was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem, people using false authority to take advantage of trust. Dean Morick summed it up perfectly when someone asked how the SEALs had known what to do. "It wasn't about being veterans," he said. "It was about standing up for each other. You don't need military training to see through a lie. You just need courage, and sometimes the backup of the people around you." That line stuck with people. The next day, it was quoted in a community forum post that drew dozens of comments. Some residents even suggested starting a neighborhood watch, not to patrol like police, but to make sure everyone had someone to call if something suspicious happened again. Calvin read those posts late that night while sitting in his living room. the silence settling after a whirlwind of a day. He thought about how close he had come to losing his nerve, how close the impostors had come to forcing their way in. Then he thought about the image of his friend standing shoulder to shoulder on his lawn, the neighbors lifting their phones, the officers arriving with sirens sounding. The lesson was not only about him keeping his house. It was about what happens when people refuse to stay silent, when they refuse to let intimidation win. But for Calvin, the real weight of it all did not settle until he was alone with his thoughts and realized how easily things could have gone another way. That night, long after the neighborhood meeting, Calvin sat on his back porch with the last of the embers glowing in the fire pit. His friends had returned to their hotels, the crowd of supportive neighbors had dispersed, and the street was quiet again. For the first time in a full day, the weight of what had happened pressed on him without distraction. The house felt different now, not unsafe but fragile. For years it had been his sanctuary, a place where he could come home from work, kick off his shoes, and know the walls around him belonged only to him. Yet one knock from two strangers had nearly destroyed that sense of security. And if his friends had not arrived when they did, the night could have taken a very different turn. Jonas, who had stayed a little longer than usual, sat in a chair across from him. He held a beer in one hand, the bottle sweating in the humid Carolina night. He did not speak for a long moment, only watched the fire dance. Then he said, "You know what sticks with me? It wasn't their costumes or the way they tried to sound official. It was how sure they were that you'd fold. They counted on fear doing all the heavy lifting." Calvin nodded, staring into the orange glow. "That's what makes me angry. Not just for me, but for anyone who might have believed them. My mother's house. She would have opened the door, seen the vests, and probably let them right in." "That's what burns me," Jonas said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe that's the lesson here. Fear works when people are alone. But when a community stands together, the scammers and the bullies can't win." The words hung heavy between them. Calvin thought about the crowd of neighbors, the phones raised, how strangers had become allies in the heat of the moment. He had not fully understood how strong his streak could be until the night before had put it to the test. The next morning, Calvin took a walk around the block. The air felt fresher than usual, or maybe it was just his mood. He passed Mrs. Hadley's house. She waved from her porch. Luis Ortega gave him a thumbs up while loading his truck. Even the teenagers on the corner, normally too cool to acknowledge anyone, offered a respectful nod. It struck him. The impostors had wanted to divide, isolate, intimidate. Instead, they had united a neighborhood. Later that week, Sergeant Willis called with an update. The two impostors were facing multiple charges: impersonation of authority, attempted fraud, and trespassing. Calvin listened, feeling both relief and a sober kind of gratitude. It was not only that justice was being served, it was that this nightmare had become a reminder of the values his father had drilled into him years earlier. Hold your ground, speak the truth, and never let fear write your story. That afternoon, his friends gathered once more for the cookout that had been postponed by all the chaos. Burgers sizzled on the grill, laughter echoed across the yard, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal again. But as the evening wore on, the conversation turned reflective. Pierce Lockhart raised his drink. "To being in the right place at the right time." Dean Morrick added, "To Cal, who held his ground before we even got here. He didn't need us to stand firm. He already was. We just made the picture bigger." The men clinked bottles. The fire crackled. Calvin felt something growing in his chest. He realized this house was not just wood, nails, and siding. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. And protecting it, protecting the right to live without being intimidated, was not only about him. It was about everyone who might one day face the same scam. He thought about what he wanted his children to learn from this, what he wanted his neighbors to remember. And when the laughter faded and the night grew quiet again, he knew the lesson was simple. Authority is not in the vest you wear or the badge you flash. It is in the truth, in the community, in standing shoulder to shoulder when lies try to break you. Fear only wins when people allow it to. As the fire died down, Calvin looked at his friends and then toward the street beyond his fence. He raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "If there's one thing last night taught me, it's this. We don't choose when trouble shows up, but we do choose whether we face it alone or together. Together we can handle anything." The group fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words floating in the air, before Jonas finally smiled and broke the quiet with a light jab about the overcooked hot dogs. They laughed. The heaviness melted back into warmth. For Calvin, the fear of that knock on the door would never disappear completely, but neither would the memory of his friends and neighbors standing firm against intimidation. And that balance, fear and unity, was what carried him forward. So if you take anything from Calvin's story, let it be this: never be afraid to question authority. Never let intimidation corner you, and always stand with the people around you. Together, you are stronger than any scam or bully. If stories like this remind you of the importance of community, courage, and truth, make sure you hit that subscribe button. There are more lessons worth telling, and more reminders that by standing together, we can turn fear into strength.